Hello everyone, and welcome to this presentation on the supportive housing programs for homeless youth under the Housing First model. My name is Krista Brandt, and I am a graduate student at Arizona State University, and I am presenting this proposal to housing authorities in my community here in Mankato, Minnesota. And so the reason I chose this proposal is that I work directly with homeless youth here in my community. The individuals I work with are ages 16 to 24 who are in transition or are experiencing homelessness. And there's this large gap of housing availability and affordable housing. And so this proposal is a look at a framework where we can place homeless youth in stable housing and continue to provide supportive services to them so that they can become independent and successful adults. Alright, before I continue explaining what the supportive housing program is, I just wanted to make sure that everyone had a clear understanding and a clear picture of what it means to be a homeless youth. And so actually the definition of a homeless youth in the Minnesota statute is an individual under the age of 24 who is couch hopping, staying in places not meant for habitation, or staying with an adult other than a legal guardian for an extended period of time. And so I think this is just a really good starting point where we can break down those stereotypes of thinking of a homeless individual, of someone who's standing on a street corner panhandling or sleeping on a bridge or under a bridge or on a park bench. And we certainly have people who do that, and that's their shelter. However, the reality of youth homelessness in the Mankato area is not that. What we're really seeing is a lot of couch hopping, and so staying with friends or staying with an aunt or uncle, maybe it's a teacher or a coach. We do have a variety that have slept in storage units or in their cars. Maybe a shelter, but a lot of times the shelters in our area, the spots are given priority to women and children or families, and right now we do have the Salvation Army, which is a men's shelter. And so there's not a ton of options for youth and for even short-term shelter options. And so that's the issue at hand here, is that there just are not enough options and placements available in this community that allow these youth to have a stable place to go at night in order to work on goals towards independence and just being productive individuals in the community. And so that's exactly what the supportive housing program is meant for. It's really taking that individual from street to shelter. And so going from a place where you're not sure where you're going to sleep at night, you're going from couch to couch, to shelter where there's one stable place to call home, and then you also have supportive services that come with that. But before we dive into that, I just want to explain the increased risk that unsheltered youth face when they are out on the streets, and why it's important that these supportive housing programs are here in the community. So bear with me, we are one slide away from getting to the meat of the presentation and understanding more of the supportive housing framework and what it means to work under this Housing First model. But before we do that, I just wanted to go over the increased risk of unsheltered youth and really what they're facing living on the streets or living in a way where they are unstable and not able to access services and in a stable place to live. And so actually the National Coalition for the Homeless reports that homeless youth are at a higher risk of engaging in unsafe behavior such as drug use, sexual favors, and victimization. And so really what I want to point out is that the longer the youth are on the street or not in stable housing, the higher risk that they are engaging in survival behaviors, which are really unsafe to their health and also the community and maybe the other people that they're spending time with. And so a lot of something that's trending really big right now in the United States, and even more prevalent right now because of the upcoming Super Bowl, is the sex trafficking. And so, we have to remember that these youth are leaving home, and a lot of times they're leaving home because of a root cause of maybe family conflict or violence or abuse or addiction. And so there's usually some sort of trauma or even long-term history of trauma that these youth have faced. And so, which makes them very vulnerable when they are living out on the streets, or are living unstable lifestyles at a young age and not really having the direction and the support from family or friends in order to become independent. And so that's something, like I said, the survival sex, and what that looks like is the selling of themselves to meet a need. And a lot of times this is the exchange for shelter, food, drugs, or money. And I would challenge you as listeners to think about, in your situation, if your car was taken away and you had no place to sleep, and you had just eaten your last sandwich that somebody had given you, how far would you go in order to get a warm place to stay at night or another hot meal? And so we have to just keep that in the forefront of our brains, of that these kids are literally fighting for survival and doing what it takes in order to have shelter at night. And so that's why the supportive housing framework is meant to come in and get them off the streets as quickly as possible and provide them services in order to get stable and independent. And so also there is this increased risk for youth having a higher risk of dropping out of school. And if we think of maybe why that is, if they're worrying about where they have to stay at night, or, maybe one night they're staying at a friend's house who's 1 block away from the school, versus the next night they're staying, in the next town over, they're not able to get to school that day, and that transportation piece goes away. They can no longer walk to school or bike to school. um, Maybe it's a lack of sleep and they just feel like they don't have support. And, I just I've just been more compassionate towards these students that, try their hardest to get to school, but, there's just a lot of barriers for them in order to do so. And I can but imagine that the last thing on their mind is to get to school and to do their homework and complete those assignments. And, when they're worrying about where they're going to stay that night. Um, and so, again, I would challenge you, what are the things that make you productive at work every day, that make you energized and staying on task? And so, if you think about that, a lot of times it's, you need some adequate sleep, and you need, maybe time for yourself to process at night or in the morning before you go to work. Maybe it's your drive to work that allows you to, get focused and to get prepared. And when you take that away, you feel rushed, and you feel like you can't focus, or, you have to think about the next thing you have to do. And so that's really what these youth are facing. And so again, when youth are transient and they're going from one place to another, it can be very difficult for them to maintain employment. Again, so maybe it's that lack of transportation or consistent transportation, lack of skills and training, and even access to good hygiene. If they have to sleep outside one night, or over and over, they may not have access to a shower every day, which we know can be a concern when you're in the work environment. And so these destructive habits, there's really no motivation, and that's not a helpful way to get them to becoming motivated to make changes or to want to do something different. Is, they're just really trying to figure out their crisis of the day, whether that be shelter or food, or getting to work. And so they kind of usually have to pick one versus all of them. And so that's why I really like that image on the screen there of that youth in the hooded sweatshirt, is that, I feel like it really gives that tough on the outside look. And but within the sweatshirt you can see different words of broken, silent, scared, um, and so really that advertisement is standing up for homeless youth and just giving them a voice, and giving them opportunities and resources in communities to be heard and to be seen, and to receive the help that they deserve to be independent and successful. So here we are. We're going to talk about the supportive housing framework under the Housing First model. And so first I just want to explain what the Housing First model is and how the supportive housing framework fits into that. And so I think the easiest way to explain the Housing First model is that it's the umbrella term in what I'm trying to propose and to explain to you as listeners. And so the Housing First model was developed in New York by the Pathways to Housing back in the 1990s. And really, it was a form of harm reduction where they offer a quick turnaround in stable and permanent housing for individuals who have been identified as homeless. And so now it's been implemented into not only adult homelessness but also youth, which is exactly why I'm proposing this here in my community and also giving this presentation to bring awareness to why supportive housing and the Housing First model is important and can be effective if implemented correctly. So I first just want to start with the framework of supportive housing. So like I said, that's really offering a permanent place to stay while additional services are provided. And so as soon as we can take a street youth off the street and put them into a stable place of living, then we can start to work on maybe the addiction or the mental health, the employment, the education. All of that stuff can come, but we have to take away that first barrier of having a consistent place to stay every single night. And so that's what we're talking about when I say supportive housing. And then just remember that that Housing First model is really the theory that covers the supportive housing framework. So it's really that umbrella term of what we're trying to do within the supportive housing framework. And so what that picture you see on the screen there is a brand new facility in Duluth, Minnesota. So for those of you who are not close to the Midwest or don't know where that's at, it's a very northern part of Minnesota. But they just recently opened that new building back in 2017, back in April. And it's called the Center for Changing Lives. And it is actually a supportive housing facility. And so what that looks like in Duluth is that they have 10 low-income supportive units for homeless youth. And so they actually have the offices down below there on the first floor, and then those colored pieces that you see up top are the apartment units for the youth who have been chosen and have been accepted into the supportive housing program. So what I kind of want to talk about too is how youth would be recruited and the eligibility, the length of stay, and then also the additional support that they can receive while they're in the supportive housing programming. So how we would do it here in Mankato and what we're working towards is that we have this database called HMIS, which is a homeless management information system. And when we meet a youth who comes to us and identifies themselves as homeless, we do some extensive paperwork with them and determine their vulnerability and their length of homelessness. So sometimes we see some older youth who have more of a chronic homelessness history, and we have some who maybe this is their first time homeless. So we try to gather that information right away, and then once that happens, we can kind of come back as a team and we can talk about who would be the best fit for the supportive housing program. And so we want to make sure that youth who are going into these programs in the community are actively working towards becoming independent and are somewhat motivated to make changes in their lives. So, and again, I want to kind of backtrack to the previous slides where we talked about risky behaviors and, just being mindful of the trauma that these youth have experienced up until this point. And so we understand that there's going to be some mistakes, and there's going to be maybe some steps backwards, but that's the part of this learning curve, is that we can come alongside them and we can help them navigate different systems in order to become more independent in their community and hopefully exit out of their program successfully. So kind of back to how we would recruit then, depending on how many spots we have available within the programming, we would choose probably how it works in Duluth at the Center for Changing Lives is they take the most in need, so maybe the most vulnerable, and those who are working or are actively looking for work, or maybe they're enrolled in school. And then of course they have to be open to having case management. And so that's the really big piece to the supportive housing framework, is that intense case management is necessary. And so you expect that when, as the housing first model, there's really no questions asked other than identifying them as homeless, but you put them in the housing right away, and then that case management happens right after that. And so there has to be that openness and that willingness to have pretty intense case management and relationship with a worker to come in and do some skill building and talk about different, budgeting, maybe it's getting their driver's license or getting enrolled in college or anything like that. So that's the additional support that comes within the supportive housing framework as well. The length of stay within these programs, it does vary on the program, and so there is a lot of flexibility within this framework, which is encouraging in that it's going to look different in a lot of cities or a lot of communities. The Center for Changing Lives, they have their enrollment is anywhere between 12 and 16 months, and so once youth are accepted and enrolled in the supportive housing program, they can stay up to that 16 months. That doesn't mean that they do. The goal is to exit them successfully into living in their own apartment and having a stable income, and are working actively towards other goals where they may not need that consistent and intense case management that they're getting within this framework. There also, I'm going to talk about this study in a little bit, but there was a study done in Canada back in 2016 where they implemented this housing first model and supportive housing framework, where they too had, it was anywhere between, I believe, 16 and 24 months that they could stay. And so it was really allowing these youth to get on their feet, accomplish some really good goals, and then work towards independence and having their own place of housing and being able to be on their own. So in the next slide, I'm going to give an example and kind of lay this all out for you. It's kind of a lot of information to take in and understand, especially if you're not super familiar with this demographic or really the understanding of how the housing first model would work. Here I've got an example laid out of what it would look like from the time that we would meet the homeless youth to the aftercare exit plan in self-sufficiency. So this is really the pivotal change in where you can visually see where the supportive housing framework is important and what it can do to help these homeless youth go from street to sheltered to being self-sufficient. And so I'm going to walk you through this example, and hopefully the supportive housing framework makes a lot more sense to you after going through this diagram. So there actually was a similar model to this that was presented in the Social Issue Research magazine back in 2012, that did exactly this. It explained what it would look like for the youth to participate in the supportive housing programming versus family unification. And so I do want to reiterate that when in Mankato here, and the services that we provide and the conversations that we have with our youth, the first goal, if possible, is for family reunification, especially if the youth is under the age of 18. We want to make sure that they're safe and that they're protected, and we do everything possible to reunify families and offer different services to them if necessary. But a lot of times that's not an option, and so we have to be creative and look at other programming and other options for the youth that we meet. And so that's exactly where this supportive housing framework comes into play. All right, so let's just say that a homeless youth comes into my place of work, and let's call him Brian. And so Brian is that youth at the top there, where he comes in, has identified himself as homeless, and we do that necessary paperwork that I told you about in the last slide. So now you've moved down to that second box where the appropriate services are given to Brian among first meeting him. So we do that HMIS paperwork where we determine his eligibility and maybe his housing history and if he would be a good fit for the supportive housing framework. And so from here, there would be kind of two options in this situation. There would be, family reunification if possible, and if not, the youth supportive housing services. And so first and foremost, if Brian were to choose family reunification, we would recommend the counseling and the case management down in that fourth box there, and maybe the caseworker would meet needs on a minimal basis, so maybe every other week, or even maybe just once a week rather than every day. And so that case manager would be there as needed, but also continue to provide services in order to kind of support the family while they figure out how to be a family again, and how to support one another. And so after that, hopefully the youth would choose to stay at home, and then we can talk about the aftercare exit plan and goals to being self-sufficient. So that's kind of that first initial goal that I mentioned earlier. But let's say Brian does not choose family reunification, and now we have chosen that third box there on the right that says youth supportive housing and services. And so from there, we choose to place Brian in a supportive housing unit that we would have set up here. And once we enroll him in the program, then case management would immediately start. So say myself is his caseworker, I would show up and we would immediately start talking about goals. And so making sure that his other basic needs are met, so that he has access to hygiene items in order to shower successfully, do laundry services, maybe he needs medical examinations done, or he hasn't been to the dentist a while, maybe he wants to enroll in college or do other things, go to college, or find a new job, or find another job. Having two jobs is very common. And then also work on any social development. So if there's any extracurriculars that Brian would want to be a part of, we would develop those goals initially, and really start working towards those. And so case management within the supportive housing programming, it's like I said, it's very intensive, and so it's going to be at least sometimes 4 or 5 times a week if necessary, but sometimes depending on the youth, it could be 3 times a week, until it's decided between that worker and the youth that it's not as necessary or as frequent. And so let's say Brian really needs a lot of case management, so I would see him 5 times a week, maybe for a couple hours, and just help him make phone calls to appropriate services. And I could help him or help with transportation to some of those appointments, and start working with him on being successful and more independent. And so hopefully through that intense case management, we can move down to that fifth box where the youth develop skills in stable housing. And so hopefully by the end of the program, because these supportive housing programs would be funded by grants, state and federal level, or even community level, this youth would not be responsible for paying rent during their stay unless it was agreed upon. There are some supportive housing frameworks where the youth does not pay rent the first several months that they're there, but as they become more stable with employment, they would maybe kick in 10% or 20% and 50%, kind of more and more as they get more comfortable with paying their rent and having a more stable income. And so that's all about that skill building, and just allowing them the space to get on their feet and learn those skills in a space where they don't have to feel like their housing's going to be taken away from them immediately if they don't do something right the first time. So that's the goal, is that at the end that they have stable housing so they can exit the program and have their own apartment and have mastered the skills of paying their own bills and signing a lease, and that they still have the stable income and have worked through some of those initial needs that needed to be met. And so once the youth has developed that, we would begin to start talking about that aftercare and exit plan. So that aftercare could definitely be minimal case management or as needed. So let's say Brian decides to get his own apartment and he exits the supportive housing unit that we had, and he goes to his own apartment. The caseworker, so myself, could still go see Brian and just kind of check in with him as needed after the exit, and just make sure that he's doing okay, and if he has any additional questions or needs any additional support at that time, we would be able to provide that. And then, of course, at the bottom there's that self-sufficiency where no case management is needed, and the youth becomes self-sufficient and has all the tools in their tool belt to problem solve and to do what they need to do to stay stably housed, and that they would have the positive resources and support systems in the community through being in this program. So hopefully that kind of makes a lot more sense to you as to what the supportive housing would look like. Like I said, the funding would come from state and federal grants, and that's exactly where the Duluth Center for Changing Lives, that's where they get their funding. So really they're paying for the rental assistance for those youth to be there, and then also for the staff who works with those who are in the units as well. So this slide is probably very familiar to you. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I just wanted to make some connecting points on how this pyramid is very relatable to the supportive housing framework, and is a good image of the ultimate goal of the Housing First model. And so there was an article in the Simply Psychology magazine that explained in depth the two types of the tier. So there's, on the left side you see the D needs, which is the deficiency needs. And so those are areas where when we lack or are deficient in meeting a need, we don't have the human motivation to seek other needs to be met. And then on top there, we've got the B needs, which is the growth or being needs. And that would be very relatable to the self-sufficiency box on the previous slide in the example, where you are motivated, you're confident, you're working on personal growth, and you're moving towards your highest potential. And so we can just relate that back to the example with Brian in the last slide, that the main goal of the supporting housing framework is to meet that first tier on the bottom there, that the physiological needs of shelter. And so we're taking away that barrier of not having a consistent place to stay. And when that need is met through the supportive housing framework, we can then start to work on the other tiers above that. So we can do the health, the employment, the family and social stability. And then once those are start to be met and continue to be worked through, then you can talk about friendships, family, and sense of connection. And hopefully by that time, these youth who are in the supportive housing units, they can start to be involved in more supportive environments and activities and really start to implement themselves in the community in a more positive and influential way. And then from there, hopefully that just builds their confidence and their achievement and respect of others. And so if you think back to the previous page where we were talking through that diagram with Brian as the example, that towards the end when we were talking about the aftercare and exit plan, that's exactly where this self-esteem piece of the pyramid fits in, where our goal is that they would feel confident enough to have an apartment for themselves, and they've got all the tools that they need and the resources at their fingertips where they can be successful, that they feel comfortable with having stable income, and that they maybe know the bus route or have maybe even achieved getting their own driver's license and a car through the time spent in the housing program. And so really we're just building on those needs, and hopefully as that case management comes along, they're meeting those needs more quickly and are able to navigate to the top of this tier where they can find that self-actualization and self-sufficiency. And so there actually was a study done in Canada where they interviewed 22 of the 44 residents after their stay in the supportive housing unit, and they actually saw that sexual and survival behaviors that we talked about earlier in the presentation had declined. However, the drug behavior was constant or even a little bit higher. Most of the residents disclosed that they were using marijuana, and it wasn't necessarily because they had to, it was more of a recreational use. And so that's important to think about too with the supportive housing framework, that we can't just take everything away from them at once or expect them to enter treatment right away or to just drop their habits. It really is a stepping stone, and this framework really just gives them the space to learn and to have opportunities to make some changes in order to be independent and successful. So I hope you learned something through this presentation, at least the awareness of youth experiencing homelessness and kind of what that looks like on a more broad level, not necessarily that stereotypical image, but also some of the options that are up and coming of housing units and affordable housing, and a way that we can make our communities better and stronger with the youth that we are raising.